Welcome back to part 2 of entomology or insects for master gardeners. In this video, we're going to look at how different insects grow and develop, their different mouth parts or how they feed, because a lot of times that can give you an indication of what insect could have done the damage on your plants. And we're also going to look at some of the different important orders or different groups of insects that we're going to be dealing with. Insects can be grouped by the different types of mouth parts they have, and this is very important to know because if you look at the damage on a plant, you should be able to diagnose what type of damage it is, figure out whether it was done by an insect or not, and then that helps to narrow down what kind of insect or what order of insects that the culprit could have come from. One type of mouth part that's very common with insects is a chewing mouth part. So this means the insect actually consumes pieces of the leaf or stem or bark. It actually tears them off, chews them up, and consumes them. It's really the most common mouth part. A lot of different insects contain this. You see the caterpillar on the right-hand side. Caterpillars have chewing mouth parts, so when they feed on a plant, they actually chew the leaf up, and you will notice missing pieces of leaf. Some different types of damage that you might see on a leaf caused by insects with a chewing mouth part look very different. So you see the picture on the right. If you look very closely, there's a couple of newly hatched caterpillars there. Obviously, when an insect is very small, it can't consume an entire leaf or chew all the way through it. So what they do when they're very small is they feed on the leaf, but they're only able to scrape off one side of the leaf. This is called window feeding or window painting, and if you take that leaf and hold it up to the light, you'll actually be able to see the sunlight through it because part of the surface of the leaf is now missing, but not the entire leaf. When these insects become a little bit larger, they're able to eat the entire leaf, but sometimes the leaf veins are a little too tough for them to consume. So they'll go along and they'll actually eat the leaf tissue from between the veins, leaving the veins behind. This kind of damage is called skeletonizing, very common with certain types of beetles, small caterpillars, and other insects. Another type of mouth part that's very common among plant damaging insects is called a piercing sucking mouth part. This is technically a chewing mouth part that's highly modified. So the insect no longer chews the leaves. What it does is it puts a sharpened appendage called a stylet and actually pokes that into the leaf or the stem or the fruit and sucks the carbohydrates and liquids out of it. So when these type of insects feed on a plant, the leaf isn't missing, but the leaf has been damaged because the insect has poked into the leaf and sucked out the chlorophyll, the carbohydrates, and the water out of it. So this can cause damage, which we call leaf stippling. Leaf stippling, picture if you take a leaf and then you take a pin and you dip the pin in ink and you poke the leaf about 1,000 times. That's exactly what it looks like. Very small insects such as spider mites, aphids, scales, and mealybugs cause this kind of damage because they poke many times into the leaf. What this does is it damages the leaf, puts a hole in the leaf, so now the plant can no longer hold the water inside, so the water will come out and the leaf will dehydrate. This kind of damage can cause leaf distortions. So when these insects feed on a very small, newly emerging leaf, when the leaf becomes larger, it's going to be twisted and distorted. And these kind of insects also cause a lot of fruit damage. Now on the left-hand side here, you see a close-up of the face of a stink bug. And it's a little hard to see, but that little long needle-like appendage coming out of its head is a stylet. And it will take that stylet and poke it into a leaf, a stem, or a fruit and suck the juices out. On the upper right-hand side, we see aphids. Aphids, when they feed on newly emerging leaves and new growth, will twist and distort and damage those leaves. And on the lower right-hand side, we have a leaf-footed bug feeding on a tomato. These kind of insects can cause a lot of damage to different types of vegetables, fruits, dooryard fruits such as peaches, plums, nectarines, because not only do they feed on the leaves and stems, they can also feed on the fruits also and cause a lot of damage. Some insects have a siphoning mouth part. This is called a proboscis, and this is what you would find in any butterfly or moth. So a butterfly or moth would take its proboscis, which is normally coiled up, would straighten it out and insert it into a leaf to drink the nectar. These insects don't cause plant damage directly when they're adults. Obviously, adult butterflies and moths don't cause any damage, but their immature forms, caterpillars, do cause a lot of damage because they have a different type of mouth part. They would have a chewing mouth part, and when they're going through their life cycle, they would chew on leaves, and if it's a valuable plant, they're causing a lot of damage to that valuable plant. Other insects, such as flies, have what's called a spongy mouth part. So what flies do is they land on their food, they spit on it because their saliva contains enzymes that start to liquefy their food. Because they don't have a chewing mouth part, they can't chew their food up directly. They have to turn their food to liquid. So first they spit on their food, which starts to dissolve it, and then they have a spongy mouth part, so they essentially lick up their food after it's at least semi-dissolved. Learning how different groups of insects grow and develop is also very important. Insects generally go through two different types of development, also called metamorphosis. Metamorphosis means change. So the changes that the insect goes through from an egg to an immature insect to a mature adult insect is very important to know. There's generally two different types of metamorphosis. The first is called simple or incomplete metamorphosis. This is when an insect goes from an egg, hatches from the egg, and at that point it's called a nymph, which is also the immature form of that insect. The nymph will feed, become larger, it molts, so it sheds its skin as it gets larger, and then eventually becomes an adult. So the immature insect looks very similar to the adult insect. The adult, of course, is larger. As a general rule, the adult is going to have wings, and the nymph is not going to have wings. That's usually an easy way to tell the difference. But they look generally very similar to each other. Some examples of this would be crickets, roaches, grasshoppers. If you've ever seen a very small, immature grasshopper, it looks like an obvious grasshopper. The adult, of course, is going to be larger, will have wings, but looks very similar to the immature one. Other insects go through what we call complete metamorphosis. This is where the insect first is an egg, which hatches. The immature form is called a larva. The larva feeds and grows, has to shed its skin several times, and at that point it forms what's called a pupa. And then after a certain period of time, pupating, at which point it's not active, it's not feeding, it emerges as an adult. So obviously this is what happens with a butterfly. You have an egg. From the egg comes a caterpillar. The caterpillar feeds, becomes larger. If the caterpillar turns into a butterfly, it makes a chrysalis. If it turns into a moth, it makes a cocoon. And it rests for a certain period of time. Then when it emerges from that larval stage, it's completely different from what it was in the immature stage. So this is complete change, complete metamorphosis. Obviously, a caterpillar doesn't look anything like the adult butterfly that it turns into, but there's other groups of insects that go through this also. Beetles do this also. Immature beetles look very, very different from the adult beetle that they turn into, and flies do this too. Obviously, immature fly or a maggot looks very, very different from the fly that it turns into. So an immature fly will feed, become larger, form a pupa, and rest for a period of time, and then when it emerges from that pupal stage, it emerges as a full adult fly with wings. So here's an example of incomplete or gradual metamorphosis. You see here we have a couple of pictures of German cockroaches, and if you saw any one of these, you would know right off the top of your head this is obviously a cockroach. The one on the far left has probably just emerged. The one in the center is a slightly older nymph. It shed its skin once or twice. And then the adult on the right-hand side looks very similar to the immature ones, but of course it's larger and it has wings also. Now, when one of these insects first hatches from an egg, we call that the first instar. It will feed, it will grow when it sheds its skin, it becomes a second instar. After it sheds the skin again, it becomes a third instar. Different insects, this varies on the species, go through different instars as immature insects. It can range anywhere from 3 instars up to 6 or more different instars. So some insects can stay immature longer periods of time and molt more, but all of them eventually, when they perform their last molt or shedding of their skin, will emerge as an adult. And normally at that point they would have wings. And here's an example of complete metamorphosis. In the upper left-hand side, we have the newly emerged caterpillars or first instar larvae. That would be the technical terminology for that. These are oleander caterpillars, so they're going to feed, they're going to grow, they're going to shed their skin, they'll eventually become a second instar, a third instar larva, and then eventually they'll pupate, which they form a case. This can be in the form of a cocoon, a chrysalis, or just a freestanding case. A lot of insects will do that. They'll form a pupa, usually either on the ground or slightly under the ground, and then they eventually emerge as a fully grown adult. So some of the different types of insects that go through complete metamorphosis: wasps will, ants do, beetles, of course butterflies and moths do, and so do flies. Different insects have different relationships with humans. For the rest of this video, we're going to go through horticulturally important insects. Some of them are beneficial insects, other ones are pest insects. A lot of them are neither pests or beneficial. They're just there, basically. So a lot of insects can be beneficial. Of course, the one thing that comes to mind is pollinators. Pollinators are very important for us being able to grow food. But a few things that people might not think about: a lot of insects are very important with decomposition. They'll help to break down organic material, dead trees, dead plants, dead animals. Other insects will aerate the soil. They help keep the soil from becoming compacted, and they're very beneficial for plants because plants will take advantage of that aerated soil. Some insects perform biocontrol of weeds, because keep in mind, not every plant is a good plant. We don't want all of them. Some plants are weeds, other plants are invasive. They've come here from other countries. So being able to find an insect that's going to feed on those weeds and invasive plants and help keep their population down is definitely a bonus. Some beneficial insects feed on other pest insects, so that makes them beneficial for us. A very good example of that would be a ladybug. I think most people know that ladybugs eat aphids and other bad insects. That's why we generally consider ladybugs to be very good insects. Many insects are a very valuable food source for many other animals, and some insects are actually used for medical uses. Some other insects have aesthetic value. They're important for ecotourism. Think of everybody who has a butterfly garden. We all enjoy seeing butterflies. We enjoy seeing different various insects outdoors, normally in our gardens, usually not indoors. And then many other insects are injurious pests. They'll feed on plants. Many insects feed on store foods. You'd be surprised at the percentage of food that's grown around the world that is lost to insect damage, so we're no longer able to eat it. Not so much in developed countries, but in third world countries that is a huge problem for them. Other insects feed on woods. Think of termites, think of a number of beetles that will damage wood in our house. A number of insects can be pests of humans. Bees, wasps. There are stinging caterpillars where if you touch the hairs on them, it can sting, and a lot of people will have a very bad reaction to that, have to seek medical treatment. And a lot of insects can be major pests of our animals, whether that be pets, whether that be farm animals and livestock. Insects can cause a lot of different problems with that. So we have a lot of different relationships with different types of insects. So as we go through a lot of these different ones, keep in mind whether it's a beneficial insect, a pest insect, a minor pest, a major pest, because that all goes into exactly what kind of control methods we're going to look to help keep their population under control. There are about 31 different recognized orders of insects, and that depends a lot on exactly what reference you're reading also. Insects, some of these different orders can be put into larger groupings, but generally about 30 different orders of insects. Now, here's a great big list of all the different horticulturally important orders that we're going to go through one by one. Please don't be overwhelmed by the names, the number of different orders. A lot of these are going to be very common to you. It took me many years to become pretty comfortable with all these different order names. So it's probably a little bit easier if we just go ahead and go through them one by one. The first order is called Blatodia, and these are roaches. Roaches have simple or incomplete metamorphosis. Some of their characteristics is, as a general rule, their bodies are flattened and oval. Their back legs are specially modified for running. That's why they run so fast. The front wings are leathery and the hind wings are folded like a fan. They generally have long antennae. Roaches feed with chewing mouth parts. They're obviously generally regarded as human pests. Now, for most of the roaches that we have here in Florida, they really prefer to live outdoors. They really don't want to live inside of your house. The one exception to that is German cockroaches. German cockroaches can be a major indoor household pest. If anybody you speak with has them, they probably want to consult a professional to get rid of them. But almost all the other roaches, even Australian roaches, which are commonly called palmetto bugs, the very large flying ones, Cuban cockroaches are very common also. Cuban cockroaches are different because you can see it's a bright green. You probably wouldn't even think it's a roach. But almost every other species really prefers to live outdoors. They like to live under leaf litter, mulch. They like it where it's dark and it's moist. Now, if you have a problem in your house or your garage where you have a leaky pipe underneath your sink, and now things are dark and they're wet, you may be creating an ideal living place for roaches. So one of the best ways to avoid having roaches is prevention. But keep in mind that not all roaches want to move into your house and set up shop there. The majority of them prefer to live outdoors, but they will occasionally wander inside. Our largest order by far of insects is Coleoptera, which are beetles. I believe there's about 20,000 different species of beetles that we know of around the world. It's also the largest group, the largest order within the animal kingdom. So there's a lot of beetles in the world. Beetles go through complete metamorphosis. So you have an immature beetle or a larva, and then it feeds, it grows, it'll make a pupa, and then eventually emerge as an adult beetle. Beetles, the adults generally have wings. Their front wings are very hard shell-like. That's the hard shell on a beetle's back, but those two pieces of the shell are parts of its wings. The hind wings are membranous and they're folded underneath the hard shell forewings. The antennas are variable. Beetles have about 20 different types of antennas, so there's a lot of variation with the antennas on beetles. Beetles always have chewing mouth parts, so beetles chew on something. Some beetles, as adults and immature, chew on plants, which can make them a pest. Other beetles chew on other pest insects, so a lot of beetles are very, very beneficial. You see the picture in the lower left there, ground beetle. Very important beneficial insect. They will scurry around and eat caterpillars all day long, so that makes them a good beneficial. Other beetles live harmlessly in leaf litter, underneath fallen logs, or just eating decaying plant material. Other beetles will cause problems because as immature beetles, they will drill into trees and kill them. So beetles are really all over the map about exactly what they feed on and whether it's a pest, whether it's beneficial. We'll look at different various types of beetles a lot more in the future. Another order of insects that you'll commonly encounter in your garden or sometimes indoors also is Dermaptera. These are earwigs. Earwigs are generally beneficial insects. Normally they eat on decaying plant matter, leaf litter, they're decomposers, they help to break it down. On rare occasion they could be a garden pest, especially if you just planted your garden from seeds and very small plants are coming up. because sometimes if you have a lot of earwigs in your garden, they'll start snipping the plants off at level. So Dermaptera or earwings, many of the different species have no wings at all when they become adults. Other ones will have very, very short wings, but either way, they're unable to fly. They're totally living on the ground. They have abdominal cerci forceps, which are the little pinchers on their back end, and they have chewing mouth parts. So they always chew their food. That's how they feed. Another very large class of insects is the class Diptera. These are flies. It contains flies, midges, mosquitoes, gnats. They vary a lot in their size, but all Diptera go through complete metamorphosis. So an immature fly is normally called a maggot, and they'll feed on whatever they happen to be feeding on. They grow larger and they'll make a pupa, and when they emerge from the pupa, they'll be an adult. So some characteristics of Diptera: the front wings are membranous. Now remember I said earlier that all insects will have four wings. They'll have two forewings and two hind wings. Diptera are an exception to that rule because they only have two visible wings. Technically, if you look close enough, and sometimes you have to actually use a hand lens or a microscope, they'll have two little nubs, which are their hind wings, but they're very, very small, very hard to find. So if you look at an insect and you're not really sure if it's a dipteran or if it's a bee or a wasp or something, if you look very close and count the number of wings, if it only has two really visible wings, it's a fly. It's in the class Diptera. Diptera, their mouth parts are either piercing sucking or sponging sucking. Some of them, if you think midges, biting flies, mosquitoes, have a modified piercing sucking mouth part. A mosquito, obviously, when it bites you, it pokes into you. So it has the same type of piercing sucking mouth part that, let's say, a stink bug or another type of insect would have. Other ones, common housefly has a sponging mouth part. Their larvae, their immature form, can be either wireworm shape or maggots. There's a lot of diversity amongst them. So the immature ones will always have either a chewing or a rasping mouth part. Another order of insects that's very, very large is the order Hemiptera. This order has been divided up different ways in the past. Currently, right now, all of them are lumped under one great big order. It's so large that it's broken up into three different suborders. And as we go through it, you'll notice that this order contains a lot of really, really common plant pest insects. So a lot of these insects you're probably already going to be familiar with. So hemipterans go through simple or incomplete metamorphosis. That means the egg hatches, and then the nymph or immature insect will feed and grow and become larger, and then eventually it becomes an adult. The immature ones look similar to the adult, but a lot of times they look different, usually a different color, slightly different shape. So it takes a little practice to be able to tell a stink bug exactly what a stink bug adult and a stink bug immature of the same species looks like. So some of the different characteristics: their front wings are half leathery and then half membranous. If you look very closely, that forewing, half of it is hardened almost like a beetle, and then part of it is not hardened. But that varies a lot with different members, different species within Hemiptera. The hind wings are membranous. They usually have a fairly long antenna, and with all these insects, they have a beak or stylet that arises from the front part of their head, because all these insects have piercing sucking mouth parts. So they will not chew on leaves. They don't make leaves disappear. All of them feed on plants by taking that stylet and poking it into either a leaf, a stem, or a fruit, and damaging the plant that way and deriving nutrition that way. So in one suborder, Heteroptera, a couple of different members here are your bottom left hand side here, stereotype stink bug. Bottom center here, a leaf-footed bug, which is in a different family from stink bugs, so they are closely related. Leaf-footed bugs get their name because the adults, if you look at their back legs, they have a flattened femur. It looks a little bit like a leaf. On the upper right-hand side, a lacebug. These can be big problems with azaleas and some other plants. And bottom right-hand side, the Jadera bug. If anybody has a golden rain tree, in the spring you will have millions upon millions of Jadera bugs. Jadera bugs feed on the leftover seeds from golden rain trees, and their numbers will become huge. People's walls of their houses will be covered with them, and of course everybody goes into a panic when they see that many insects. They're totally harmless. Golden rain trees are invasive. You really shouldn't have one in your yard anyway. They produce millions of seeds. So Jadera bugs, all they do is they just feed on the seeds. They don't hurt anything. Technically, they're beneficial because when they feed on the golden rain tree seeds, they ensure that not all of them are going to germinate and sprout, which is a benefit. So these are all the different members of the one suborder of Hemiptera called Heteroptera. Another suborder of the order Hemiptera is Achenorhyncha. You don't have to remember the name, just know that these insects are all related and they're all grouped together. They all have the exact same type of mouth parts, so they're all going to feed the exact same way, and they're going to cause the same kind of damage and the same kind of problems. So a lot of these, on the right hand side, this includes cicadas. Cicadas are never a plant pest. Technically, immature cicadas will live on and feed on trees, but they never cause any damage. They never have to be controlled. In the center here, we have sharpshooters. Below that, a leaf hopper, tree hoppers, plant hoppers. Many of these insects are triangular shaped. You notice from the plant hopper and tree hopper, they all have piercing, sucking mouth parts. They all feed on plants in one way or another. Some of them feed on leaves, other ones prefer to feed on stems. Plant hoppers will make cottony debris. It will almost look like your plant stem has a little bit of cotton on it for some reason. If you go in there with the hand lens, start poking around, you're going to find the plant hoppers hiding under that. Other members of this group will pretend to be thorns, pretend to be part of the plant. Tree hoppers, you notice tree hoppers can be shaped like thorns to try to kind of blend in with the plant. But all these are pests. They're all very common pests, and they're all grouped together in the same group, Achenorhyncha. The third suborder of Hemiptera, Sternorhyncha, contains a lot of really familiar major pest insects. This includes psyllids, whiteflies, aphids, scales, mealybugs. Psyllids can be really bad pests. Keep in mind the one disease that is spread among citrus trees called citrus greening is spread by the Asian citrus psyllid, which is an invasive insect. It came here from Asia, along with citrus greening, and spread citrus greening around. Whiteflies can vector a lot of different viruses to plants. They're a major vegetable pest because whiteflies will damage plants directly by feeding on them and damaging them that way. Some of these insects will, the terminology is vector different diseases. When a whitefly feeds on a plant that has a certain type of virus, it will pick it up on its mouth part, its stylet. So when it flies to another plant and starts feeding on it, it spreads that virus to that plant and the next plant and the next plant. Aphids run the gamut. This picture is of oleander aphids that are bright orange. Aphids can be brown, tan, green. There's a number of different species of aphids. They're all pests. There's no beneficial aphids. Fortunately, a lot of beneficial insects do feed on aphids, which helps. So becoming familiar with what aphids look like and what beneficial insects that eat aphids look like is a very important thing. Scales are a major plant pest. There's two different types of scales. There's a hard-shelled scale and the non-hard-shelled scale. So scales have mostly have a hard covering over them. The actual insect is underneath that covering. They'll spend their life on a plant stem, poking into it and sucking the nutrients out of it. Mealybugs are very common. They leave a lot of white cottony matter, which is kind of a good indication that you have mealybugs. But all these insects are all closely related, and keep in mind they all have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So here's a little diagram of an armored scale. This is what it looks like underneath that little hard shell. It creates the shell, it excretes it from its body as it grows and matures and has to shed its skin, but the actual insect is living underneath that little hard shell. A lot of times you look at the plant and you know that obviously the picture on the right hand side here was taken under a microscope. These are very small insects. You usually need a hand lens or a microscope to tell for sure that you have scales. The order Hymenoptera includes bees, wasps, sawflies, which is an insect that you've probably never really seen before, and ants. You never would have thought that ants are in the same order as bees and wasps, but they are. Hymenoptera undergoes complete metamorphosis, so they hatch from an egg. The larvae are either shaped like a caterpillar or a maggot. They feed, they grow larger, they pupate, and then they come out as adults. Some of the characteristics, the front wings are large, the hind wings are much smaller, both are membranous. They don't have a hard shell covering like a beetle would. All of them have chewing mouth parts, that's how they feed. The body is strongly pinched between the thorax and the abdomen. They're very, very narrow there on the adults. Some of them have stingers. The stingers are really modified ovipositors. An ovipositor is a structure that an insect has that it will poke into a leaf, a stem, or a tree trunk to lay its eggs. So bees and wasps have modified ovipositors that they use to sting with to defend themselves. The picture on the bottom right-hand corner here is a red-headed pine sawfly. This is an insect in its larval form, looks very much like a caterpillar. They'd be pretty easily to mistake it for a caterpillar. It really matures into a wasp eventually. Another important order of insects is Isoptera, or termites. They are social insects. Termites normally mature into adults that don't have wings, but every once in a while when the group wants to expand where they move to, they will produce adults that have wings. Then they swarm, a large number of them fly out, they fly off, they mate with each other, they find new places to build nests. Termites are very important out in the woods, very important recycler insect. They break down dead trees, they break down organic matter into a form that plants can use. But of course they're very damaging also when they get into our homes, when they get into our wooden structures, then they're eating our wood and they become a major problem. Lepidoptera is the order that includes butterflies and moths. Some of the characteristics are the adults have wings that are covered with scales. The adult mouth parts, like I covered earlier, is a coiled sucking tube or a proboscis that it uncoils, inserts into a flower to be able to drink the nectar to get energy from. Butterflies have large compound eyes, but the larvae have chewing mouth parts. And technically, you might think that earlier when I said that insects have 6 legs, you might have thought, oh, caterpillars have a lot more legs than just 6. Technically, if you look closely at a caterpillar, the front 6 legs look different. They're jointed and they're shaped differently from all the rest of the legs on the back end. The other back legs are called prolegs, and technically they're not legs, it's just an extension of the body that they use for walking. So even caterpillars still technically have 6 legs. Mantodia, or mantids, or some people call them praying mantids, very pretty insects. Here in Florida we have about 24 different species of mantids that live here. They're generally not quite as large as the ones up north. Many of you might remember from living up north, if you ever did, the very, very large green mantids. Those are Chinese mantids. We don't have anything quite that large down here in Florida. But if you look out among your, if you're working out in your garden enough, you're looking around your plants, you'll run across them. They're beneficial insects. They're only partly beneficial because they'll eat any kind of insect that they can get their claws onto. So they may eat a caterpillar, which is a pest. they'll just as easily eat a ladybug, which is beneficial. So they're not really picky about whether they eat pest insects or beneficials. But they're very pretty and interesting insects nonetheless. Neuroptera is a very important order of beneficial insects. They all undergo complete metamorphosis. Neuroptera includes lacewings, green lacewing, brown lacewing, and also antlions. You may be familiar with antlions. They also call them doodlebugs. The immature antlions will make a little hole in the ground, and they make a little upside down impression that when an ant is crawling along the ground, it'll fall into its hole. The antlion is waiting for it at the bottom and eats it. Green lacewings and brown lacewings have a similar type of larva. If you see in the bottom left-hand corner here, is this little unusual looking insect. They're very common. If you're looking at your plants and you have a pest insect, like let's say aphids, maybe mealybugs, or something like that, a lot of times you'll see lacewing larvae also. The larvae are also called aphid lions because what they do is they'll walk up to an aphid, they take the long pincher-like mouth parts that they have, grab a hold of it, and suck the contents out of the aphid, and then toss the empty aphid's body off to the side like a crushed beer can. So the immature lacewings are very, very beneficial. The adults, like the picture in the upper left-hand corner here, are very small. Normally, the green lacewings are a bright lime green. Brown lacewings, which are less common, are brown. They have very intricate wings with lots of veins. You'll see them flying around at night. They're normally attracted to lights that you might have on outside at night, but they're very important beneficial insects. Odonata is another insect order that includes dragonflies and damselflies. They go through simple incomplete metamorphosis. Their immature form is aquatic, which means immature dragonflies and damselflies live in the water and breathe through gills. Technically, their immature form is not a nymph. There's a specific term for it. It's called a naiad because they are aquatic. They do have gills. They have large compound eyes. They see very well. The adults are predators. They're beneficial. They catch very small insects, moths. They catch and eat a lot of mosquitoes, which of course makes them beneficial. The easiest way to tell if one of them is a dragonfly or a damselfly is if you wait for it to land on a blade of grass or a branch. If when it lands, it stretches its wings out totally flat, it's a dragonfly. If when it's at rest, it folds its wings up behind its back, it's a damselfly. That's the easiest way to tell. The order Orthoptera includes grasshoppers, crickets, katydids, and mole crickets. Orthoptera undergoes simple or incomplete metamorphosis. If the wings are present, and some grasshoppers and crickets don't form wings even when they're adults, but most of them do. But if the wings are present, the front wings are leathery, the hind wings are folded like a fan. All of them have chewing mouth parts. They may have large compound eyes, generally have long antennae, and their hind legs are specially modified for jumping. Now, katydids are pretty much never a problem. You're never going to have an issue with katydids. Even though the adults and immatures eat leaf matter, they rarely congregate or cause enough damage to a plant for it to be a problem. Crickets are never a problem. They also eat plant material. If they get into your house or your garage, they're going to make all that noise and they might, disturb you, but they're never a plant or a household pest either. Grasshoppers can occasionally become pests. The majority of species in Florida prefer to live out in the woods or a field, but occasionally we do have problems with lubber grasshoppers. Every couple years we'll have an outbreak of the American grasshoppers, which is a large grasshopper that every several years its population just grows very, very large where it can actually be a garden pest. And of course, mole crickets can be a pest of Bahia grass. Their general preferred food is just Bahia, and it's more of a problem for people who have pastures or large areas of Bahia. They're growing Bahia for to cut down for hay. For homeowners, you may get a few mole crickets if you have a Bahia lawn, but it rarely gets to the point where it's a big enough problem where you actually have to take action or treat for it. Phasmatodea, or walking sticks. Just wanted to include this because they are present here in Florida. In the fall, it's very common to encounter walking sticks in grassy areas, mostly in fields. You rarely see them in gardens. They're rarely a problem. They do feed on plant material, but you're never going to have them become a big enough problem in your garden where you have to take any kind of action against them. But we wanted to throw that in there just for because they're interesting insects also. Socophora. These insects are also called soakids or soakid bugs or book lice or bark lice. You may encounter these because outdoors, soakids will build up in populations, and you will probably notice a tree that just has a large mass like the center picture here. A huge grouping of very small insects. They're not too much larger than a pinhead, all kind of crawling and milling about on the trunk of your tree. A lot of people who happen to notice these think it might be a pest. They call the office, they bring in samples. They're really not a pest. They exist outdoors on tree trunks. They mostly eat fungi and algae off a tree trunk. They never damage the trees. They never cause a problem. Every once in a while, their populations will build up and become really, really large, and we'll actually get calls about them getting in people's pools, where they just have literally millions of them in the pool covering the surface. Other than that, chances are you'll never really encounter soakid bug out in the wild. I think I have maybe 2 or 3 times. Book lice you may encounter looking through an attic or garage for books. They'll inhabit the book and start eating the paper. So they can be an indoor pest, but very, very rarely. But definitely an interesting insect. They're really fairly nondescript. You generally need a microscope or hand lens to get a look at them. Something that's distinctive about them is they have very long antenna that's broken up into many, many different antennal segments. So if you see a tiny little insect, that might help to give you a clue that it's a soakid bug. Siphonaptera, or fleas. Fleas can be a pest of humans. They can be a pest of domestic animals. They can be a pest of livestock. They undergo complete metamorphosis. So the picture of the larva on the right here is what they look like. The larva can eat dead skin, dirt, organic matter. Then they drop off the host and pupate and come back as the nasty adult you see here on the left. We don't really deal an awful lot with fleas. There's so many different pills and supplements that you can give to pets. Domestic pets seem to have fewer problems with fleas. They're an occasional pest. Some years or some seasons they become really bad, but fleas do have their own separate order. And then the last order that we're going to talk about in this video is called Thysanoptera. They're commonly called thrips. These are very, very tiny insects that feed on plants. They undergo an unusual metamorphosis, intermediate metamorphosis, kind of between complete and incomplete. Like I said, they're very tiny insects. You may see them on plants if you're looking at the plant with a hand lens. The adults have wings and a very fringed, edged, lacy kind of wings. They could be a really bad plant problem, but you'll rarely see them because thrips usually come out in great numbers in the spring. They'll feed on plants, and they really like to feed on the brand new, teeny tiny, just emerging leaves. They'll feed on the leaves, and they have kind of a unique way of feeding on plants. They don't really have piercing, sucking mouth parts. What they do is they scrape the leaf and then suck the juices that come out. So they do a lot of damage to brand new leaves. So when that leaf grows out and becomes larger, it's going to be twisted, curled, desiccated. Sometimes plants that are damaged by a lot of thrips, and knockout roses are a very good example. That's a host for a couple different specific types of thrips here in Florida. What they'll look like is like you just hit them with a flamethrower. They'll look brown and dried out. The leaves will all be dried and crispy. But a lot of times, by the time you notice the damage, the thrips are already left and moved on. So that's one of those insects you need to be aware of, although you're probably rarely in real life going to actually lay your eyes on one. And that's about all we have for video number 2 of entomology. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me and ask. The picture you see here is of air potato beetle larva. Now, air potato beetle is an insect that eats plants. You see, these are the beetle larvae right here. This is kind of a common look for leaf beetle larvae. They'll feed on the leaves also. You can see it looks like they just have a head. If you look real closely, there is a thorax there, a big abdomen, almost a little grub-like, but not exactly. These are beneficial beetles because we deliberately brought them here to this country from parts of Nepal and China to breed them and release them to eat air potato vine. And if you don't know what air potato vine is yet, you will, because we'll bring some into class and we'll bring some samples of the beetles in, and we're going to use this as a really good example of biological control that we use to control a really, really bad invasive pest plant, which is the air potato vine.